Hey guys, how's it going? Coach Garcia here. So we're going to go ahead and look at the system test review. We'll start with number one. Number one says Joel was given the following graphs and asked to give the system of inequalities that are represented by each graph. His answers to each of the questions are below. He made mistakes on each system. Find the mistakes and correct them. All right, so basically it's just about, can we read the graphs? Can we figure out where his mistakes would be and how to fix his mistakes. So basically with something like this, you just want to go one graph at a time and just correct it as you go. Anytime that we're dealing with graphing, we're always dealing with the equation y equals mx plus b. And so the way that I graph might be a little bit different from what your teachers tell you. I always start with my b, or in this case my y-intercept. Then I move over to my m, which is my slope. And of course, as I work through these, I just kind of cross them out so that I don't use the same letter again. So I'll use my y-intercept, and I'll use my slope, and then I'll cross that out. And then the last thing that I'll do is I'll look at the y, and I'll look at the inequality, and that'll tell me what type of line I need and which way I need to shade. So the graphing, I think, takes the most time on the test. So if you guys are taking your test, or if you guys are watching your video and then you take your test, I would encourage you guys to skip the graphing first, go on to like the solving, all the other stuff, and then come back to the graphing. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So first equation, we have y less than or equal to 2/3 x minus 2. So in this case, I want to circle my y-intercept. That's where I want to start. So at -2, which means that I start at 0, 0, I go down 2, and I go ahead and put my very first point. So far that looks okay. I cross that out. I then move on to my slope. In this case, my slope would be 2/3, which you always want to, somewhere off to the side, write your slope as rise over run. Rise over run in this case would be 2/3. And the way that you always read these is you say rise of 2, which means that we're going up 2, and then run of 3, which means that we're going to the right 3. So then we just check to make sure that that is correct. So we go up 2 boxes over 3, we put another point. Up 2 boxes over 3, we put another point. Up 2 boxes over 3, we put another point. So it looks like I am going through and creating that line. So that slope looks like it's correct. And then so the last thing that I do is I look at my y and my inequality. Whenever we're looking at inequalities, anytime that you have less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, that line underneath them tells you that we should have a solid line. But if I look at the graph the graph that's provided for me, it's a dotted line, so the very first mistake needs to be that needs to be a solid line. That's the first mistake. And then we look at our inequality. Anytime that our inequality is pointing towards our y, that means that my y is small, and that means that I would shade down, which it looks like they did in fact shade down, so that part looks okay. The only thing here that he needed to fix was make that into a solid line. We go into the next equation. We start this time at +5. So from 0, 0, I go up 5, and I put my very first point. And really all this is just kind of like tracing back, making sure that they graphed this correctly. Next is his slope. So again, we don't use the 5 again. We go over to the slope. This time my rise over run would be 3/2. And 3/2, again, both of these are positive, so rise of 3 means that I would go up 3. Run of 2 means that I would go to the right 2. So from this point, we would go up 3, 1, 2, 3, over 2. 1, 2, 3, I can't really do that, but I can go backwards, down 3, to the left 2. And already I see that I am not creating the line that's given to me. So instead, it looks like what he did is he went down 3 over 2. Down 3 over 2, which would be a negative slope. So the second thing that he has to fix is make that into a -3/2x. That's his change. It needs to be it either needs to be a negative or he needs to actually graph this correctly. I guess technically his mistake was that he needs to just graph this correctly. The actual line that he needs to make is down 3/2 would look something like that. Going through these points. And then lastly, we look at the inequality, and I've already made a mistake. The inequality does not have a line underneath it, so the line that's connecting these should be dashed, which we can just kind of erase a little bit, kind of make it dashed. But it should be a dashed line. that connects these points. And then finally we should be shading up, so even his shading is incorrect. His shading needs to be that way. Just for time's sake, I'm going to let you guys see if you guys can fix B on your own. So see if you guys can fix it. I think there's a mistake on either one, both the top and the bottom. Again, just for time's sake, let's go ahead and move down to number 2. Alright, number 2 says graph the following system of inequalities. Verify one ordered pair in the solution by substituting it into the systems in the box below the graph. So now we go into graphing. Anytime that you guys are graphing, your equations always need to be in y equals mx plus b, or slope-intercept form. In other words, your equations must be in this form for you to graph. So if your equations are not in that form, then that means that we have to rearrange the equation, solve for y, get y by itself, and then we would be able to solve or be able to work our problem. So with these, what that means is that actually both of these equations I have to go through and have to solve for y. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite the first one over here. We have 5x minus 3y less than or equal to 12. So to solve inequalities, we still draw that line down our equal sign, even though it's, the inequality, even though it's not an equal sign, we still draw that line. Remember, the whole objective to get an equation in a y equals mx plus b form is to get the y by itself. So what I would suggest is that you always start off by boxing in your y, identifying what you're trying to get by itself. Now when you box in your y, you want to make sure that you include any numbers and any signs that come before it. So in this case, we're including the negative 1/3. The negative 3. Alright, once we identify what we want, we would cover that up, and then we would get rid of the other thing. In this case, we need to get rid of that 5, so we would subtract 5x from both sides. Alright, when we subtract, that goes away. This is always going to come down. And then we make sure that we bring both of these down. We should never combine an x with a number, so they both come down. I always write my x first, so this would be negative 5x, and then the 12 here is technically positive, so we have plus 12. Alright, that's my first step in solving. And really, every time you solve an equation from standard form into slope-intercept form, it's going to be 2 steps. So then from here, we want to make sure that we can get the y completely by itself, so we divide by the thing in front of y. In this case, we're going to divide everything by negative 3. So negative 3 over 3 reduces to 1, and we're left with just the y. So we have y. I'll talk about my inequality here in a little bit. This, you always want to make sure that you type it into your calculator. I would encourage you guys to do alpha y equals, type in the negative 5 on top, type in the negative 3 on the bottom. That way you get a fraction, because you're going to need a fraction when we graph this here in a little bit. So we would type both of those in. Our calculator would give us 5 over 3x. Make sure that you guys also bring down the x with it. And then 12 divided by negative 3 is going to give me negative 4. Alright, now I said I was going to come back to the inequality. The reason that I wanted to come back to it is because if we notice we divided by a negative 3, and any time that we multiply or divide by a negative number, it affects our inequality. So right now my inequality was pointing towards the y. Since I divided by a negative number, that's going to flip, and it's going to actually point the other way. So now the equation that I need to graph is going to be y greater than or equal to 5/3 x minus 4. And then of course now we can actually talk about the graphing part. With graphing, you want to make sure that you start always with your y-intercept, start at the back, work your way forwards. So you start on this side, you work your way that way, to the left. Alright, so we start at the negative 4, y-intercept of negative 4. Remember, your y-intercept is on your y-axis. That's the one that goes up and down. So we start at negative 4, so we go down 4, and we put our very first point, or our starting point, at negative 4. Once I put that starting point, that's all that negative 4 is good for. And then that means that I then move on to my next bit of information, which is my slope. So this I can always write as rise over run. And if I rewrite this as rise over run, I would have the fraction 5 over 3. Right? All I really did is just bring it down. Rise of 5 tells me that I'm going to go up 5. Run of 3 tells me that I'm going to go to the right 3. So from this point, I just keep following that rule until I run out of space. So we go up 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over 3. Put the second point. Up 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over 3. And then it looks like I can't do it anymore. Of course, if you don't already know this, you can always reverse it. You can go down 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then over 3 the other way. And of course you know that you did this correctly if your points line up. Alright, so once I'm done with that, then I cross out my slope, and then the last thing that I look at is my y and my inequality. In this case, my inequality has a line underneath it, which means that the points here should be connected with a solid line. And I do not believe I have a straight edge here. I can use one of my sticky notes as a straight edge, I guess. So you would take your straight edge and you would connect the points, in this case with a solid line. Hopefully a little bit neater than me. And then of course we need to figure out shading. Anytime that you have an inequality, you're going to have some sort of shading. In this case, the inequality is opening up towards the y. If it opens up towards the y, that means that my y is big. If my y is big, then we would shade everything above that line. So with your pencil, just very lightly, you would shade above that line. So there it is, shading above the line. Alright, so there's my shading. And then of course you would work the second equation. Really quickly I can work that one as well, and then I think we're going to have to end the video just because of time. But my second equation would be x plus 3y equals less than or equal to 6. So I'll go ahead and write it over here. X plus 3y less than or equal to 6. And then of course we do the exact same thing we solve. So I start off the exact same. My objective is to get the y by itself. So I need to move the x, so I subtract x, subtract x. Of course, it might help you if you put a 1 in between the negative and the x. But really, we should never be able to combine x's and numbers. We bring both of these down. Again, it's the more you do these, the more you realize, hey, it's just the exact same steps. That 6 is positive, so plus 6. Keep your inequality, and then we have positive 3y. My next step is to divide by 3. And again, this is where putting the 1 in front of the x kind of helps you a little bit. So 3 divided by 3 gives you a big 1. We bring the y down. So we have y less than or equal to. This time we don't flip it because we divide it by a negative, or sorry, by a positive number. And then we have negative 1 divided by negative 3, which gives me negative 1/3 x. And then 6 divided by 3, which gives me plus 2. So there's my second equation. And of course, with the system, you have to make sure that you graph both equations on the same graph. So then this time we start with the plus 2. That means that we go up 2 units and we put our starting point at our y-intercept. Once we're done with the 2, we don't use the 2, and then we just, same thing as before, we go right down the row. This time I have negative 1/3 as my slope, so if I write this as rise over run, my fraction would be negative 1/3. And of course that negative either goes to the top or it goes to the bottom. You have to decide. In this case, I always try to let it go to the top. That way I just have to decide whether it's up or down, and then we're always going to move to the right. So in this case, negative 1 moves me down 1. Right? Negative is down. And then positive 3 is going to be to the right. Alright, so from here I'm going to go down 1 to the right 3. So from this point we're going to go down 1, right 3. Down 1, right 3, down 1, right 3, and then of course we can reverse it, up 1 to the left 3, up 1 to the left 3, up 1 to the left 3. Alright, and then just like before, we look at our inequality. Our inequality says y less than or equal to. Again, the less than or equal to part tells me that I'm going to have a solid line. So looking at my graph, I can create a solid line, which a sticky note maybe isn't the best for drawing lines. So there's my solid line. And then it looks like my y is small in this case. My inequality is opening up towards the equation. My y is small, so we shade it down. So I always encourage you guys to kind of like crosshatch, which means that if you shade one way, then whenever you graph it or whenever you shade it again, to shade it in a different direction. So that way you can kind of tell where the darker part is. And so if I shade it this way, it looks like my darker part is going to be in this section right here. So my solutions would fall in this section right there. And so any solution that you have, your ordered pair, say for example, I'm just going to choose a really, really easy one, 0, 0. right? That would be in that double shaded part. And then just to justify, what you would do is you would take your point, plug it into these, and then just check to see if it's true or false. So for example, this, for that first equation, my x value is 0, my y value is 0. So really all I do is just plug in the zeros in there. So 5 times 0 minus 3 times 0 less than or equal to 12. And then you just check to see if it's true or false. So 5 times 0 is going to give me 0. Negative 3 times 0 is going to give me 0. So really I have 0 less than or equal to 12, which is in fact a true statement. All right, so that's how you would go through and you would check. Once again, I'm going to leave this one up to you guys. This one's already solved for you, so this one you can actually go through and solve it yourselves. Or not solve it yourselves, but go through and graph it yourselves. The one thing that I'll say with that first equation is if you are doing it with my method, my encouragement would be that you swap the 6, so you put the 6 over here, and you bring the negative 2 and you bring it to the front. So this equation would then turn into y greater than negative 2x plus 6. And then that way you can start with the 6, then go over to the slope of 2, and then graph it and shade it from there.